All right, so hello everyone. We're about to start recording the first interview in our Creation of Knowledge series. This is a series that's been planned as an exploratory project on the various methods, modes, and styles of knowledge creation as they're prevalent across various disciplines within academia. And today, as our guest, we have Dr. Marian Kelsey, whose most recent employment was as a lecturer at the Department of Theology at the University of Nottingham here in the UK. So, Marianne, let me start by asking you to talk a little bit about your academic background, your background in research, what sort of drew you to this subject, and yeah, what sort of research you do, basically.
I do biblical studies. I started off doing a theology and biblical studies degree undergraduate, and then over time increasingly moved towards biblical studies and the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And so I then did a master's and did my Ph.D. on the book of Jonah and in a biblical allusion in the book of Jonah, how it connects to lots of other biblical books. And since then, I've been broadening out. I'm looking at cities in the Hebrew Bible at the moment, the role and the function of cities in the Hebrew Bible. And I also do a little bit on the reception of the Bible in art and music. And so that's another little side project of mine. But in general, what I look at is the relationship between texts and beliefs and communities.
Mm-hmm.
And so the community writes the text, and then the text influences what that community believes. And then what they believe influences how they read and interpret and pass on the text. Mm-hmm. And so I'm looking at that cycle in my work.
A very relevant question to me is, what sort of drew you to this very specific area within biblical studies? So for example, say when you were studying your undergraduate degree, did you do a research project? Did you do a summer project that first made you realize that this was an area that you really enjoyed working in?
For me, it was almost the first semester of undergraduate where I had not really studied anything to do with the Old Testament until then. And then so I took a module in the Old Testament because I was really interested in the New Testament, but I thought, well, I probably ought to understand the Old Testament in order to understand the New. And so almost reluctantly took this module in the Old Testament and just got absolutely hooked because I was raised Christian, but what was opened to me by the way that I was taught the Old Testament by Dr. Tooman, who later became my doctoral supervisor, was this.
You said at the University of St. Andrews, like
Scotland. Yes, yeah, St. Andrews, yeah. And it just felt like a completely new world to me, a world that I didn't know very much about and didn't understand much about. And so I wanted to learn lots more about it. And so I just carried on like that. And then I did do a summer project on humor in the Bible, which was a lot of fun. And that told me that I really, really enjoyed research, and why that was more or less when I decided to do a PhD and carry on with biblical study.
So you said you were raised Christian. So when you were growing up, did you read the New Testament or the Old Testament that much or that attentively?
Not so much myself. It was more something that was just around me all the time. I did go to church regularly, and so you always had the readings. And I feel like it's much more in our culture, the New Testament.
Sure.
And so various parables and things people have familiarity with.
So was it
just because they're...
was it the Anglican Church or Catholic?
Yes, yeah.
Right, so the Bible
Anglican
reading was I'm guessing, the St. James version.
I think it was probably the New Revised Standard Version, which is like a revised and updated version of the King James.
I saw.
Just slightly more modern language.
Right, yeah. It has a St. James, okay. Very sorry. No, but did you, when you were like going through these texts as a child, did you ever realize that those texts could be, I don't know, texts with a lot of academic interest to anyone? Or did you just like have them in your life
Um,
and you never really thought much about uh, the importance of those texts outside of, let's say, religion, like basically like when you were young, I'm saying, like when you were like in your early teens or something.
feels like it's going back away. I'm trying to remember what I thought about it. Um, I think probably the biggest change in how I thought about these texts came when I was a late teens,
Mm-hmm.
looking round universities. And before that, the Bible had been something I encountered mostly in church, and in churchy religious ways.
Yeah.
And then when I was visiting Durham University, on an open day to see whether I wanted to go there, we heard a talk by one of the Hebrew Bible lecturers there. I think it might have been Stuart Weeks, but I
I think
certainly
they have a
didn't
very
know or remember
famous,
his name.
they have a very famous department, right, in theology. Sorry, did you lose me? I was saying, isn't Durham known for having a very serious department in theology?
Definitely, yes, yeah. And I so nearly went there. In the end, I went with St Andrews, but I did go to Durham for masters, and so I came back. But yes, it was definitely the real pull for that university was the theology department. But I listened to that talk by the lecturer, and it was on the Book of Jonah, in fact, and it was exploring the idea that the Book of Jonah was a satire or a parody of
Mm-hmm.
other biblical texts.
Mm-hmm.
And I remembered sitting there listening to that thinking, oh, I didn't know you could do that with the Bible. And it was really exciting to find that you could essentially study the Bible like you would any piece of literature
Interesting.
and find it just as clever
Mm-hmm.
and just as interesting rather than a book filled with sentimental religious lessons.
Or inalienable, or sorry, or like unchangeable truths. Yes, okay. But I'm saying, so it was
Mm.
not difficult for you then, like mentally or at like let's say intellectually, that transition from being a church-going, Bible-reading Christian to a Bible-studying theologian.
No, I mean it wasn't very difficult. I'd never been a biblical literalist,
Right. Okay.
so that was fine. I understood that there are different ways to read the
Yeah,
texts, and that doesn't necessarily make it any less religious.
of course. Yeah. No, so when you were studying, like going back to your um, days as an undergraduate student, so when you were studying all these texts as an undergraduate student and you were thinking about what you might want to do later, was it always in your head that you wanted to pursue a career in research or in academia?
Not as a definite plan. I knew that I was enjoying my study, and as long as I enjoyed it, it made. But I wouldn't say that when I started off in undergrad, I was thinking I would want this for the rest of my life. That, as I just increasingly realized that actually I never want to leave. But I always knew that I was enjoying this quite a lot.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I think my internet connection or maybe your internet connection is lagging a bit sometimes.
Okay.
So like I lost you for a couple of milliseconds there, but I think I got the gist of what you were saying. Right. So now coming back to your research, like you when you choose a subject, or I can't really say a problem. For example, the way we deal with problems in our papers. You know, we think of a problem and then we try to come up with a solution. So would it be fair to say that in your area, this business of finding a problem and then trying to find a solution need not always be the main motivator behind the creation of a paper? Like for example, you might maybe want to explore a theme or a topic or a question, not a theme or a topic, let's say. uh, I can't really see how that approach can essentially work in maths, pure maths, say. In pure maths, mostly it comes from problems. Like you have a problem in your mind and say, or say you create a problem and then you pursue like different approaches to it. So is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, it's certainly, this is one way of doing it, to pick up a theme or a book and explore it. You can also find problems and decide to try and find the solutions to
Can you
them.
give an example?
My undergraduate dissertation was a particular biblical passage where somebody wrestles with a man called Jacob, and the person who wrestles with him is never identified, but it's either God or an angel, essentially.
Okay.
And so you can pick on that problem and say, I'm going to try and work out who this other person is.
That's yeah.
Um,
I mean,
but probably
I don't mean to belittle
one person,
this
one
paragraph.
scholar would.
Sure. I don't mean to belittle this paragraph, but an analogy with popular culture could be like finding out who the Half-Blood Prince was.
Sorry, that's just a phone call. I'll get my phone off.
Did you hear what I said?
No, sorry. Can you repeat that?
I'm saying like a funny analogy with popular fiction could be trying to find out who the Half-Blood Prince was in this.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Like
yeah.
that is a question. Like, yeah, let's try to find out who it was. Was it Snape? Yeah, sure. Right. So when you then write your work, write down research, and then send off your papers for publication to various journals, how do you know whether or not that work has been done before? Like we can, like as I was saying before we started recording, like if needed, we can reference our conversation with things that are present in front of me on that paper of yours that I was talking about. So for example, can I share my screen? And okay. So this is a paper that I think you published this year, in the Journal for the Study of the Old Testament. And it's titled The Book of Jonah and the Theme of Exile. So there is an abstract. I've read the abstract and I've also read the paper. And there are some keywords. So as you were planning this paper, as you were like putting in the hard work that went into creating it, how did you not, how were you convinced, or what sort of methods did you take? Oh, sorry, I mean, how did you know that this work hadn't been done before in precisely the way you were doing it? Basically, how did you know that?
Well, when you would start researching a paper, the vast majority of the work you do on a paper is reading what other people have done before. And so this paper, it's of my thesis. And so there was 3 years worth of reading other work on Jonah in the run up to this paper, which is quite unusual because it was part of the whole thesis. But for any paper, you'd expect months of work, most of which is just reading. And you would read what everyone says and what patterns they see in the text, how they see the text as working, and you would decide whether you found that convincing or not, or whether you felt like that was the full story or not. And if you felt like you had something more to add to the conversation, that's when you could start the paper. And so for this particular paper, for example, I'm looking at allusions in the book of Jonah. Lots of scholars had pointed out allusions here and there in the book, say, oh, this allusion is, this verse alludes to this text, that verse alludes to that text. But what I felt like was going on in the book of Jonah is that the author is pulling together lots of different allusions into a kind of allusion complex, a system of allusions, referencing multiple different texts, which aren't referenced individually, but are referenced collectively, pulling them all together within the book of Jonah and using that as part of the document. And so that was I felt like it was a new pattern that other people had not commented on in the text before. And that's what that paper.
No, but I mean, then again, like as you said, you try to see what other people have done, and then you try to figure out whether you have anything new to add to the conversation. Like that, until then, until that part, I understand everything what you're saying. But how do you know, again, like coming back to my earlier question, that what you are trying to bring in is new? You can know it's original because you are thinking it, but of course to check whether it's new or not, you have to maybe, I don't know, literally read everything that everyone else has written on the subject. But is that possible? Because, like, for example, in one of my areas, there is this concept that was first introduced in a paper in 1994, right? And then I could see all the papers that had cited that paper, and then I could sort of check all the papers to see whether what I was trying to do had been tried before, had been done before. But like that sort of exercise, I mean, is it possible, like say in your area?
I think you would do it as far as
As far.
possible in terms of accessing all of the papers and books that you could.
Mm-hmm.
It might well be that after you've published, somebody would come up and say, "Oh, I found this 18th century volume in a
Right. Yeah,
theology
that's
library
yeah.
that everyone had just forgotten about."
Mm-hmm.
And oh, look, it makes exactly the same argument. And then you would think, damn it. But, you know, people would still, if that argument is not in the present scholarly discussion, then your paper is still bringing that into the present scholarly discussion.
Sure.
The 18th century book point. And so the next time you published a version of that paper, you would just have to say, oh, the person came up with it and reference the book. So I think in our field, we can never quite rule out that, because it's been thousands of years, literally thousands of years, you can never else has come up with that idea before, but you just do it.
Yeah, I think I lost you again for a couple of seconds, but I didn't miss any of what you said. So again, like, well, not again, but so therefore, in your area, since the literature is going back so many centuries at least, if not thousands of years, the written literature, I'm guessing in most cases it is not that easy to work without having access to a good library, like a good physical library.
Yeah, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So did you
You
find?
need,
Yeah.
yeah,
Sorry.
and
So
a lot of it is just isn't online.
yeah. So researching, like doing research in the time of a lockdown, in the time of a pandemic, can be like more difficult for someone like you. Let's say, I don't know like exactly what paper you're thinking of writing right now,
Yeah,
but
it certainly created a lot of problems. Yeah,
right.
and it's a lot of publishers, and there's been a big push now to put a lot of monographs online, which weren't previously available online, which will hopefully be a good permanent change in our discipline. But our discipline is still extremely dependent on paper journals and paper books, which you just can't access online. Yeah.
Yeah. And if it's a book from the 1700s or the 1800s, and no one has yet like archived it online, it's going to be very difficult for someone to do it right now, when the book itself might be at a physical library somewhere, or like far from where people are, like, I don't know, based right now. So now, say if we move to the question of how reviewers of journals or referees who work for journals decide on the merit of new submissions. So like just on the topic of just on this topic, how is it done? Like in an area that is not built on, let's say, I mean, it's kind of doing it in literature, I'm guessing, right? Yeah. So how is it done? Like I know very little about this, so just enlighten me.
I think mainly they will be assessing the soundness of the argument. And so the feedback I've had when I've submitted to journals has been looking at whether there is enough evidence for the conclusions that I'm drawing, and whether it is introducing a new argument into the field. But it won't be a case of evaluating whether that paper is right in the editor, in the referee's eyes, because ours is a discipline where disagreements do exist and are irresolvable, and that there are no right answers. And so most referees will be looking at whether they think the argument is sound, rather than whether or not they're convinced by it.
Right.
Yeah.
More about the soundness of the arguments rather than instead of whether or not they can be proved to be correct. I'm guessing. So for example, in my area, a paper can, let's say, be 3 pages long and have 3 proofs, all of which can be verified, like on the spot, like you follow the arguments and you see whether the sort of flow of logic is proper or not. So, but that's about, I mean, the bit that you just explained is about, I don't know, determining whether a paper is genuine or not, is original or not. But from there, how do you go to deciding, or how does one go to deciding whether that paper is worthy of being published in the journal that's like been sent to? Like, are there any like parameters? Like, I'm gonna give this paper, I don't know, 9 out of 10 for innovation, 8 out of 10 for new interpretation or something, and like that, then you add them up.
It probably depends very much on the journal. Certain journals will certainly look for innovation in biblical studies, doing things in a way that hasn't been done before. And so some journals might be looking at queer readings of the Bible, things like that, which are just relatively new. And so they'll bring in a lot of papers that are doing something completely new in the discipline in that way. Whereas some of the more traditional journals will only be evaluating whether they think this is a sound argument saying something, making an argument that's new about the text, rather than whether it's an innovation in the same way that a queer reading might be. And
when you say queer reading, do you mean literally strange reading, or like readings made in light of LGBT activism?
LGBT stuff, yeah, that's a kind of very quickly growing area of biblical studies at the moment, looking back at these texts with.
Can you say a bit more about it? Because can you say a bit more about what queer reading is? I have no idea.
I mean, it's not my area, and so I can't. I'm probably not going to give a particularly full explanation of it. But some examples might be looking at King David, who has a very close relationship with Prince Jonathan, and examining whether that can be understood as a homosexual relationship in our terms. And the relationship between Ruth and Naomi, things like that.
I mean, my own take would be, if the reader in question wants to understand it as a homosexual relationship, then please do, and that's it. But I'm guessing the story doesn't end there. You have to then make a coherent argument about why that interpretation is in line with, I don't know, like a mountain of evidence and all that, right?
Well, in biblical studies, there are broadly 2 approaches to the text. One is to understand it in its historical context. And so then you would be looking at what possible meanings could have in its historical time period. Perhaps what did the author mean when they wrote it? What did the original readers understand when they read it? And so that's one side, and that's probably more what I do. But then the other way to look at texts, because they are religious texts, is to look at them in a more reader response way. And so then you would be looking at the reader's perspective in reading it. And then queer reading certainly are much more frequent in that approach to the text. And things like, could this text be used within the church in a way that is affirming of homosexual people, because we can take a text like this and say, this is affirming of my reality and my life.
Right, yes. And so say, what was the name of this journal again? Journal for the Study of the Old Testament. So say I have sent a paper to the Journal for the Study of the Old Testament, and the referee, like to whom the paper has been sent, is sort of say going through it and is reading my arguments. How is that referee going to check whether those arguments are, like, again, like going back to my previous question, are genuine or not? Like, of course, I'm guessing it is probably not going to be that difficult for the referee to check whether I have come up with those arguments in good faith. I don't mean it with a pun, obviously. Like you, but like to check that nothing like that has ever been done in that field or a related field before. Because sometimes, for example, in some theoretical disciplines, like say pure maths, obviously theoretical physics in some cases, even philosophy in some cases, like it turns out that say someone did something while proving a theorem in algebraic number theory, and then it turns out that at the same time someone sort of aped that proof and made it work in, say, in a certain like context within algebraic geometry. But if the referee doesn't spot it and sort of holds the paper in very high esteem, then that can be harmful for like future generations of mathematicians. Because, well, I mean, harmful in the sense that if they know about the link, they can do more about figuring out, I mean, they can do more to figure out how those two fields can be related, how one can come up with a theory that unifies the sort of two relevant theories in question. So how do, like, is it really difficult being a referee in this field? Like, I'm guessing you have refereed papers yourself as well. Like, is it?
Not yet.
Okay.
Some of what they would do is check whether the arguments you're making are accurate in terms of the biblical text. And so you
Okay.
say, these verses are the only verses in the Hebrew Bible that use these
Is it
particular
references?
words, and the referee will perhaps look at their own software and see if that's accurate. And then the referee will always be an expert in that area who has done a lot of reading in that area. And so they will think, is this paper saying something new that I haven't read before in any papers or
Okay.
monographs? And if it is, then
So here
good,
we're making
that's
the
good.
assumption, you know, as I said, like since the referee has done a lot of reading, the referee should know in a way, let's say, whether or not something resembling that argument has already been made
Yes.
or published before. Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Sorry?
no, sorry, I thought you were in the middle of a sentence. But yeah, so if we now go to this paper that I brought up earlier, so can you just talk about what you were sort of like in a way, like, I don't know, trying to achieve with that paper? Because clearly it's a very successful paper because, well, we have this rule of thumb in maths that if you see a journal whose name goes journal of, then something very standard, then that journal ought to be a very standard journal. And by that like token of logic, it seems to me that this journal that we published in, Journal for the Study of the Old Testament, is a very standard journal for people like who study the Old Testament essentially. Um, so that's why I'm saying like it's a very successful paper of yours. So can you just talk about like why it's a good paper? Like I know it's an excellent paper, otherwise they wouldn't have published it here. And it seems to me that's a fair assumption to make. So yes, so just talk about like what you did and how. Yeah, yeah.
So in this paper, I'm pulling together multiple illusions which
If
have
you ask me to
been
go to any
previously
section, I can
suggested.
just go to that section. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Pulling together multiple illusions that have been suggested in the literature before. And so various people have suggested that the Book of Jonah alludes to narratives of the exile. And the Book of Jonah, other people have suggested that the Book of Jonah alludes to the primeval narratives, and so the kind of creation of the world sort of narratives. And other people have suggested that the book of Jonah alludes to the Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
And what I have done is looked at these three sets of allusions and highlighted the commonalities between them. And the commonality is that when the book of Jonah alludes to primeval stories, it's not alluding to the more positive aspects. It's not alluding to things like the world was created and yay, it was good. It's alluding to aspect primeval narratives which involve exile. So being God of Eden, Adam and Eve being exiled from the garden. And then the Exodus allusions to positive event escape and rescue by God. But the book of Jonah doesn't focus on those aspects of the Exodus. What it focuses on are the aspects of the Exodus where the people were unhappy with being sent away from Egypt because they had meat to eat in Egypt, and then they're in the middle of a desert, and they initially were not very pleased about this. And so I've highlighted that it's exilic motifs in the primeval stories and the Exodus stories that the book of Jonah is using here, as well as other references to the exile proper in some of the vocabulary that's used. And so I highlight that in the first place. That's the kind of the material finding from the book of Jonah. And then there's also a methodological finding, which is that this is how the author of the book of Jonah works. This is what he does with texts. He pulls together multiple narratives with similar shared motifs or themes, and he uses them all in coordination in his book.
Is a very like, well, possibly naive question. Is there any sort of historical consensus or biblical consensus on who the author of the book of Jonah was? No, right?
No, we have no idea. No idea at all.
So is it still therefore not problematic, or I don't know, risk prone to refer to motivations, personal motivations, and sort of like attribute them to the author of the book of Jonah?
It's very problematic, and there's a lot of debate about it, whether you can really talk about what the author is doing. And so there's different language that people sometimes use for it. They say they're talking about what the assumed author is doing, what the assumed narrator is doing. But in the same way that if you picked up Jane Eyre or something like that, and you had no idea.
I was thinking Shakespeare. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, if you had no idea who wrote that, if say you gave it to somebody who'd never heard of the author, and you just said, read this book, tell me what's going on in this book, the person might still be able to speculate and say, it seemed the author wanted to give this impression. And so that's as far as we're able to go with most biblical texts, because we don't know who wrote it.
Is there any kind of consensual view towards the question as to whether these books were written by any one person?
That is where religious considerations tend to come in, and very conservative people will say that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, that sort of thing. A guy called Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew.
Sure. I'm saying besides those claims, is there any kind of historical consensus on, say, as to whether, say, the book of Matthew was written by one person?
There's a lot of historical debate. I think the Gospels are, people are more likely to think they were written by a single person, each of them by a different person. Things like the book of Jonah, because it is so short and fairly coherent, a lot of people think it was written by one person. But then 3 chapters are narrative, like storytelling, and 1 chapter is a poem. And so some people say, no, a different person wrote the poem. And then there are even some people who think that different chapters were written by different people. This is a big
there are similar conversations with certain like Shakespearean plays, isn't there? Like I know of, I should have I can look it up even now, it will take me a few seconds. Like there is one play where it is believed that Shakespeare didn't write the first act or something. So perhaps,
Yeah.
and as I was saying,
Yeah.
like if you talk about Jane Eyre, but I don't know. I think a better, well, I'm sure it's a good example, Jane Eyre, but say I don't know if you give someone Paradise Lost, long poem, it will, even if it was written by one person, it might be quite tempting for someone to arrive at a different conclusion. Like if they didn't know that
Definitely.
it was done by
Yeah.
one person, because oftentimes
Yeah.
these acts of, like the acts of writing these books tend to be extraordinary events, let's say.
And also, like, an additional problem in biblical studies is that it's not just a case of the like original author. These texts were passed down for hundreds and hundreds of years
Oral
by
tradition.
scribes who copied them out by hand and quite often added bits, inserted bits, revised bits. And so you're not just looking at the author, you're looking at multiple layers of redaction on top of it. This is a big area of study, redaction studies, where you try and pick
I mean,
apart
it
that,
happened with
that thing.
the. I'm guessing you're aware of Aladdin, the lamp, the prince of, what was the city, Shahrazad or something. So the book is the 101,001 Nights. Uh, Interestingly, like to the best of my knowledge, the story of Aladdin didn't appear in the original, like in the original edition that has survived, isn't there, but it is there in the first French edition. So it is believed that the sort of Arabic to French translator sort of added
Adding it.
something. And
Yeah,
then
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, and then there was a very famous English edition of that book by Richard Taylor, not the, like not the actor, Richard Taylor, and there was a lot of extra stuff, again, that probably didn't exist. That sorry, that isn't there in the versions of the original that have survived. So yeah, so these problems uh, are there, like always with us, even with books of far lesser importance or of far lesser, let's say, relevance. So so I'm trying to go back to the journal question. Is it possible in your area to, for someone to figure out just by looking at the publication records of two researchers, like that, I don't know, say researcher A is better than researcher B? Like, is it possible? Because if they were to do that by looking at citations, I would say that probably wouldn't be a very wise approach, because maybe researcher A has done something which is so niche that people wouldn't probably appreciate it, I don't know, in the next 50 years or something, and then suddenly something else will come up. Like as you were saying, like uh, LGBT readings of the Bible and other biblical texts. If someone did that in the 1800s, and I'm not saying there were research journals in the 1800s that were eager to publish such things, but say someone did that in the 1800s, tried to get it published, no one showed an interest, and just like he just put it somewhere in his like in his shelf. Uh, that text, if found today, would be of immense importance, wouldn't it? And similarly, so it's very difficult to figure out whether researcher A is better accomplished than researcher B. So how do people make decisions on whether or not they should hire someone like strictly like research records wise? Like how are the decisions made in theology?
It is a very difficult decision in theology, partly because it breaks down into so many subfields, and so different people are just doing different things. And also because of that thing where there aren't right answers. And so different people will have different opinions over who is the better researcher. And there won't be a way to resolve those differences in opinion. I mean, I don't know whether you're asking like in reality, how do people
In
choose
reality, yeah.
a researcher, or in practice, or in kind of theory?
No, in reality.
In reality, the decision is usually based on how many journal articles you've got out.
And is there
Yeah.
like a ranking, like a hierarchical system that says this journal is better than this journal?
Yeah, I mean, some journals are very much better. There's the kind of classification. Peer-reviewed journals are better than
Of course, no.
non-peer-reviewed journals.
I'm just talking about
And then there are some very high-end journals, but I would probably say that matters less than quantity in the field as it operates today, because so many departments are so concerned about ref when it comes to hiring somebody. And so they just want somebody who produces a lot, that they can
Okay.
add to ref.
That surprises me. But so say you have two papers in very good journals, three in good but not the best journals, and two others that have been submitted but haven't yet been accepted or rejected. And say someone else has just, I don't know, three papers in very good journals, like in the best journals, and that's it. So I don't know, maybe they will prefer you like axiomatically because you just have more papers.
That seems to be how it works. This is obviously based on a lot of gossip about what I hear about hiring committees and things. If you have long lists of publications, it generally looks very good. It means that you keep producing work. And because the ref cycle comes around so frequently, if you have 3 papers in very good journals over the last 10 years, that's still not many papers per ref cycle. Whereas if you have 10, some in good journals, some in less good journals, that might still be more papers per ref cycle. And so more chances of upping your scores in the ref cycle.
Like technically speaking, of a ref cycle.
I forget exactly how often the ref is done. It's maybe every 5 years, something like that. Maybe it's...
Really? What do you mean a ref is done?
Oh, the Research Excellence Framework. Do you...
Sure. Okay.
Yeah. And it's what determines how much money the department will get from the government.
Right.
And theology departments are often tiny and struggling in terms of student recruitment and money and staff hiring. And so financial considerations are really big.
Yeah, I think I lost you for a few milliseconds there again, but yeah, I didn't miss anything you said. Yeah, that's a very interesting point that you made there at the end about student recruitment, about like advertising to young, bright, like curious minds, the many charms and thrills of, I don't know, studying theology. How would you say one could do that? Like, is the answer outreach events? Is the answer, I don't know, sending people to churches and asking people to like do what they were doing at church for the rest of their lives, but with a different outlook? Because as you were saying earlier, like it was that lecture at Durham that sort of changed your life, not the sort of numerous visits to churches like that preceded that. So like what could be a good approach, do you think, to attract more students?
I think probably it's not necessary to try and advertise and outreach in churches, because religious people who want to study this subject come anyway. The difficulty is in persuading...
Come anyway, did you say?
Yes, yeah. A lot of people come to university to study theology because of their own personal faith.
I mean, from what you said earlier, I thought that never happens. I thought only those I thought only those people come to study theology as an academic subject who are already quite sort of cognizant of the fact that these texts can be studied as like works of literature. No, then I mean, of course, you know more about me then.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people come to study who are religious just because they want to find out more about their faith.
Okay.
Not everybody's faith survives a theology degree, and so that can be a slight problem. But what in terms of numbers, what theology departments really struggle to do is to convince non-religious people, because of course there are just a lot more of them, that this is nonetheless an interesting subject to study.
Yeah, because from what I heard from you today, I mean, it seems to me like an obvious way of advertising and it would be to just tell people, if you like literature, just think of this as a kind of literature, and that should do it. And also, like, there are certain mathematical tools that one can employ while studying like literary topics. For example, say, I mean, well, these are basically like computer tools. Like, say you want to see how many times a certain thing has been done, like strictly speaking, in a text that is, I don't know, thousands of pages long. There are like programs that can work that out. If you also want to see, like, what's the oldest reference that's been made in this text, that sort of stuff. Like, how many times has this thing been done? By this thing, I mean, like, with your work on biblical allusions, like, how many times has this concept been alluded to in within this very short period of time, like that sort of stuff. I mean, I don't see people doing that a lot, even in legal studies, because in legal, when people study the law, like as an academic discipline, like they tend to do this a lot, but still they try to count, like, like with their hands, whereas they can do these things.
Bible software is huge,
Okay.
and a
That's
massive money
reassuring.
spinner.
What is Bible
And
software?
it's software that you use to study the Bible, and so it'll do straight, like you pick on a word in the Bible, and it'll tell you how often that word appears. But also, the more complicated kinds will involve tagging
Right.
the morphology of the word, so the grammar of the word. And so you can say, I want to see how many times this verb is used in
Mm-hmm.
this stem, with this person, with this gender, with this number, and then it'll come up with it. And a lot of cross references between different parts of the Bible, between the Bible and scholarship, especially the older scholarship. A lot of stuff on the scrolls, and so stuff that didn't make it into the Bible, and kind of seeing what vocabulary and ideas are shared between those. And so it gets very complex, and it's incredibly expensive. You pay hundreds and hundreds of pounds for a decent program. And so I think a lot of people are making a lot of money from that.
By people, you mean people running the softwares?
Selling it, yeah, the people selling the
It's
software.
not free for all. Well, at least not free for
Um,
all who are, I don't know, affiliated at universities even.
it depends on the university. Some universities have bought licenses to
Right.
particular
Okay.
software.
Okay. Yeah, that it's a bit like, I'm guessing, having access to Science Direct that we have because we are affiliated to the University of Manchester here. But do you think, like, in normal life, people who are, say, monks, or, yeah, monks specifically, monks, priests, I don't know, ministers, what are some of the other words? Like, do you think they tend to look down on people like you who study the texts that they sort of build their entire lives around, but with a different like outlook?
It depends a lot on the minister, and it depends on the biblical scholar.
Yeah.
Some biblical scholars are coming at it from a fairly anti-religious point of view, and so they'll be saying that, oh, this new discovery proves that such and such was rubbish.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of biblical scholars are just coming up with better ways to understand the text.
Yeah.
And a lot of ministers are very interested in that, because for them the text is extremely important.
But have
And
you?
so it's much more common to find a lot of dialogue
Okay.
and cooperation between the two. And a lot of churches do help fund theology departments, the lucky theology departments,
But
because ministers take these degrees training for being a minister.
yeah, yeah. That's why I said earlier that in my previous experience, everyone that I had seen being described as a biblical scholar before was already in the sort of monastic order. But
Mm-hmm.
well, I'm not so sure if uh, departments being funded exclusively by churches. It didn't say exclusively.
Not exclusively, no. It's just
Yeah,
like
yeah.
a top up, I
Yeah,
suppose.
but yeah, departments being funded exclusively by churches or any religious institutions, I don't think is a good idea. But the reason I brought this up is because, like, in almost all walks of life, this contrast between someone, let's say, a little bit puritanical, like someone who has been in that stream all their life, uh, to be, I don't know, to sort of go through the ranks in a very traditional conservative way, and someone who does the same thing, but from the outside using, I don't know, modern tools, modern approaches. I mean, that contrast is always very interesting. It happens also within politics. Yeah, I can think of a very good, I mean, are you aware of this TV series called The Young Pope?
No.
I think, yeah, I think it's a short TV series. It's not that good. So Jude Law plays a young pope, and there is a bit in there where the pope meets the prime minister of Italy, like at the Vatican, and the sort of atmosphere is very tense because this man, the prime minister of Italy, has been like democratically elected, has a mandate from the people and all that, whereas the pope's claim is, I am the what's the word, like he's the sort of representative, he's God's representative on earth or whatever. And that can, that contrast is always interesting. Of course, this scene wasn't that interesting. It was just bland and dry. But I mean, yeah, so that's why I was interested to know, and you have of course answered it, as to whether like monks, priests, people of the cloth tend to sort of look at people who are in the research departments of various theology departments with a sort of, I don't know, lens of disdain, but maybe not. Because, as I said, like if both of them are coming from a similar outlook, that we are more curious, we want to see what this is, like why this is important, why this is useful. And I would say even those people who are like strictly anti-religion or irreligious, and I'm not just talking about atheists, I'm talking about people who sort of despise religion. I mean, of course they have maybe very good reasons to do so. But as I said earlier, like at the very beginning, you are very interested in the communities. So it is sort of self-evident that these texts have had lots of impact on how communities across various centuries, various continents, sort of like conduct themselves with, like among themselves, in interactions with each other, and so on. So since those interactions are like predominantly, let's say, done in a spirit of love or joyousness, so maybe it is a good idea to just keep looking for more ways to interpret the texts. Uh, we can maybe end with one final question on how you plan on how you plan future work. So, for example, I mean, you will soon be, I'm guessing, employed as a lecturer, or I don't know whatever the term
So,
will be, like teaching associate, research fellow, whatever. So when you write, like like those research statements, I don't know if you guys, surely you have to write research statements in your applications, right? So I am seeing this problem like troubling my own sort of applications, that whenever I'm trying to write a research statement, the only decent research statement that I can produce is the research statement that talks about what I have done and what I can do, developing the sort of ideas and concepts that I've already introduced in my work. But if I am applying for a job and the job is, say, in algebraic geometry, like a little bit far from what I do, I can maybe write a decent research statement after a couple of days of reading a lot of papers or abstracts of papers and that sort of stuff. But that research statement will sort of lack conviction, if you see what I mean. So, do you have similar trouble?
not so much, because my new project that I keep pitching in my applications,
Is
it's
it
spun
one?
off.
Is it one new project, or is it like a range of new projects?
The one that when I've applied for jobs so far, they've asked for a research proposal for your next topic, sort
Mm-hmm.
of thing. And so my first topic for my thesis was Jonah, and the topic of cities came up
I
in
didn't get
that.
that. I didn't get that. Can you say again? What was your first topic?
Jonah, the book of
Jonah.
Jonah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. And cities came up in that, but somewhat on the edge.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I want to look at cities across the rest of the Hebrew Bible. And so it's a development, but it's also substantially different from my
Right.
thesis. It's using different texts, a different subject matter that I'm interested in. I can see the similarities between the two, my shared interests, which is that kind of community and belief and text sort of interrelationship. but the areas in which I'll be applying those
Right.
interests are quite different. It helps that my thesis was on this tiny book, which is only about 4 pages long in the Bible. And what I'm looking at now is more a theme throughout the whole of the Hebrew Bible. And so then I can talk about new things. And I do talk about some work that I've already done on the project. I've looked at the city of Tyre and explored that a little bit. And so I can say, I want to do this with other cities in the Hebrew Bible. Please let me.
Have you like done a lot of traveling in Egypt, Israel, Palestine?
No, I haven't. Because I'm dealing with the texts rather than the archaeology, it's not necessary, but I'd still like to at some point.
Have you ever been
But
to
I haven't yet.
Israel or Palestine? Okay. I mean, so like I'm guessing in the future okay. I mean, do these countries have good research departments in biblical studies? Do they?
Israel has a lot of good ones.
No,
Yeah.
Israel I can understand. What about Egypt?
I don't know, I have to say.
Because
Not ones that I've heard about, but that might just be because of the things I've heard so far.
yeah, and it also might have a lot to do with like politics even. Who knows?
Yeah. I can imagine it being more difficult to operate as a Hebrew Bible scholar there than it would be in Israel.
Yes, I mean, yeah, axiomatically. But do you read Hebrew well?
Ancient Hebrew, and it's important to say there's a difference between modern Hebrew and ancient Hebrew, and so
Like
I
ancient
read the
Greek, modern
ancient
Greek.
kind.
Yeah. So do you
I
speak?
couldn't go to Israel and get by in modern Hebrew. It's entirely, it's like Latin, the sort of thing I do.
But can you read, I don't know, the Times of Israel in Hebrew today?
It would be very difficult because that would be modern Hebrew, and it's also when modern Hebrew is written, they don't tend to put the vowel signs in,
Right.
which they didn't use in ancient Hebrew either. But our Hebrew Bibles today have added all of the vowel signs, and so I'm used to seeing the vowel signs, and so I could pick out individual words where they've been the same, but I couldn't. It wouldn't be something that would be easy.
And do you also read? Can you also read ancient Greek? Okay, but not modern Greek, or do you read modern Greek equally well?
No.
Oh, I see. And how many languages can you read the Bible in, let's say?
Hebrew, Greek, and Latin are the 3 big ones for most of the Bible. But because it survived in so many different languages and areas, that there's, if you want to kind of thoroughly get into biblical studies, there's a lot more to learn. There's Aramaic, different things you learn for different subjects. A lot of Ethiopian languages, because so many texts have survived in Ethiopia, and so getters and things. Some of these I will learn in time, Aramaic for sure, because it's very close to Hebrew, and
it used to be spoken where, like in modern, like in places that are now in Syria, like that sort of.
I don't know again how much overlap there will be between ancient and modern versions. I'm just not sure.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting because I have been trying to, well, develop good reading skills in French for a while. I can sort of understand algebra in French, but just algebra. But if it goes to like algebraic number theory, like it becomes difficult because like I have read a few algebra papers in French and I can sort of see what they're talking about, even if I can't follow the verbs, for example. Like I know the.
Yeah, I mean, I learned German because a lot of biblical scholarship is in German, and so I've been trying to improve my German. I took it at school, and
To me, why German? Why is a lot of this stuff in German?
essentially because of the Reformation, which started there, and so it kick-started a lot of biblical studies in German, and it just
Holy
kept
Roman
being.
Empire, like the Holy Roman Empire and all that.
Martin Luther.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. No,
Yeah.
even the Holy Roman Empire was essentially like German, right? After a point.
This is not my area. I couldn't say.
I think so. Well, whatever. No, because, yeah, well, Holy Roman Empire, not the old one, but yeah, sure. Oh, cool. This was such an insightful conversation. Like insightful because of the insights that you put in, obviously, not because of anything I said. So, do you have anything to ask me or add before we stop recording?
I'd be interested to know what other representatives of other subjects are you looking at? What other
Sure.
subjects?
So, I have chosen. Well, I chose theology because I was thinking about theology, and then I couldn't think of anyone not insanely famous. Uh, all the people I knew or could sort of like think about were very, very famous. Like there's this professor at Exeter, a
Mhm.
very difficult Greek name. She appears on BBC. She used to appear on BBC programs a lot. But do you know who I'm talking about? It's a she. Yeah, well, I was like, of course, I can't contact her. Uh, and then I was just looking up people on Twitter, and then like with the mysterious ways, like even given the mysterious ways in which like big tech operate, like a day later, I was told on Twitter that I should follow you. Seriously, like a day later. The day I searched all these people, nothing came up. And then I was like, who is this? I have no idea. And then I looked up and then I said, oh, okay, I remembered because your sister had mentioned once that she has a sibling who studies theology. And then I sort of connected the dots. I said, okay, okay,
Mhm.
this must be that like theologian. And then, yeah. So theology, and I want to bring someone from history, but not just any kind of history, like migration studies. Like I know someone who looks at
Mm.
various flows of migration that have happened across history, but from the point of view of a historian. So I mean, this person doesn't really look at the numbers and the economic impact and all that, but from the point of view of a historian mostly. And then I want to bring in someone from philosophy, but also like a very specific sort of area of philosophy. And then finally, I want to bring in someone from, like, it is kind of biology, but I don't know what the correct word for it should be. But yeah, like either that or someone from archaeology, like Indiana Jones. Um,
Mhm.
but because, like, in my mind, what you are doing, literature, archaeology, they're all essentially history in a way. And in my mind, what I do, like all of science to me is philosophy, and all of this is history. Well, I don't mean literally, but philosophy as in like you put down some axioms and then you build on them, then build more, build more, build more. And in these cases, like someone did something, then you did something more, always keeping an eye on what the person before you did, what the sort of people before you did, and so on. But yeah, it's not a very helpful approach. So yeah, that's the list of subjects whose sort of representatives you will see, people will see on this series if anyone sort of watches this series. That
Sure,
is.
they will.
No, I have to advertise it properly, and I have no idea how I can put it on Facebook, but it might not seem very interesting at first because as I said earlier, I have no interest in making this too too much like what's accessible to the general public. I want to sort of keep the discussions very proper, so that like whoever comes on can talk about what they do using terms like from their own like academic lexicon. Yeah, I'll stop recording now, and then maybe we can speak for a few minutes. Yeah, let's see.